I had the idea for Clariel quite a long time ago because Clariel begins with the character Claw of the Mask, who's an ancient necromancer. And she's been drawn by a hidden power to the shores of the Red Lake. And the book opens with Claw, dressed in the furs of the northern barbarians and with a bronze mask on her face, accompanied by two free magic creatures. And she's a secondary character in Clariel and Abhorsen, an ancient necromancer who then becomes one of the greater dead. She's killed, but doesn't die. And when I was writing Clariel, and I was writing about Claw of the Mask, in my manuscript book, I made a little note to myself. It just said, who is Claw? How do you get to be an ancient evil necromancer? And that was the seed idea. And that was way, way back, probably about 1999, something like that. And I made that little note, that little side note in my manuscript book. And years later, I came back to it and I thought, I want to tell the story of Claw's early life. I want to see who she was. And that's what Clariel is about. It's an origin story for an anti-hero, basically. It's about a young woman who will one day become an ancient evil necromancer. I'm not a huge active researcher as such. I'm kind of like a lazy researcher because I read non-fiction all the time. I read biographies. I read everything, and it all goes into my head. So I'm always collecting little bits of interesting facts and little stories, both real and otherwise, and I draw upon them when I'm writing a book. I didn't actually do very much active research for this book. I did look a little bit into some of the guild systems in the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. So I did buy a few books and borrow a few books about how very big medieval cities worked, because most of the book is set in Belisaere, the capital of the Old Kingdom. And it's kind of like a 15th century European city with the addition of, charter magic and free magic. So there's that difference. So I did look into the economics of how guilds worked and so on, but of course I adapted them for my own purposes. But I'm sure there's many, many more things in the book which I just picked up accidentally along the way because I like to just read non-fiction. I like to read history, myth, legend, biography, you name it. You never know what small thing might be useful and you can use or adapt in your own fiction. I think the challenge with writing a prequel are very similar to writing a sequel. I guess when you're writing a sequel, often you're picking it up very soon after you've been writing something, so that's easier because the story's still in your head. With Clariel, probably my greatest challenge was that I had to go back and reread all my earlier books and my earlier notes, which isn't something I really like to do. I like to move forward. I don't really like to go back and read my own books. In the same way, I always have difficulty listening to the audio books because I always, as I'm hearing them, I think, oh, I should have changed that sentence, or wish I hadn't done that. Though, of course, I'm still very proud of the books. But there's still very often small things I would have liked to change. So for Clariel, the main thing for me was having to go back and reread Sabriel, which I wrote more than 20 years ago, was published almost 20 years ago. Clariel and Abhorsen, which I wrote 15 or 16 years ago. So it was a long time ago, and I had to refresh my mind with a lot of the small details, not just in the published books, but also in my notebooks from that period. So that was probably the biggest challenge, is making it fit within the overall story that I'd established in the other Old Kingdom books, and also the world that I've built up over time in those books and in the short stories that I've written that accompany it. The basic elements of charter magic and free magic are all the same. The world is long established. There's no great changes there, but Clariel is much more about free magic than charter magic, whereas Sabriel, Clariel, and Abhorsen are much more about charter magic. So I guess what I'm doing in Clariel is exploring a part of the world that was already there, it's already established, but we're just seeing a little bit more about how free magic works and how it can be employed and what happens when you use it. So there's an area of the world that I wanted to look into a bit more. I really enjoyed going back to the Old Kingdom. I enjoyed discovering more about Belisaere, the capital of the Old Kingdom. It's very interesting. It's like returning to somewhere familiar and then discovering more about it, discovering the things that have changed, discovering new stories. I just like telling stories, and telling them in a familiar framework, I guess, is something that is both sort of comforting and challenging, because it's comforting because you're familiar with it, but it is also challenging because there's a lot of people out there who love the previous books and so have high expectations. So I certainly felt both the enjoyment of being back in that world and writing a story set in that world, whilst at the same time in the back of my mind there was I hope readers like this one, because of course it can never be exactly the same, or it shouldn't be. I think it's important to look into new areas and write new stories. So there's the comfort, getting back into that world, and then there's also the challenge where you want to write a really good story that is new but will still satisfy readers. It's one of those questions you can't answer. And it's actually a question that I think it's not meant to be answered. It's a rhetorical question, where the real answer from my point of view would be that it's probably a bit of both, which I'm hedging my bets there. I think it's one of those lines that I wrote a long time ago. People really respond to it, which is great. I don't know what it means either. It means whatever you want it to mean. Yes, there will be more books in the Old Kingdom series. I'm writing another book now, which is a sequel to Abhorsen. It picks up fairly quickly after the events of The Creature in the Case, which is, or Nicholas Sayer and The Creature in the Case. It has two different titles depending where it was published. It picks up fairly quickly after the end of that novella, which itself takes place 6 months after the end of Abhorsen. So it's going back to that story, continuing that story with Clariel and with Nicholas, and with a whole host of other characters as well from the previous books. And again, telling a somewhat different story, going to some different parts of that world. And I'm writing it at the moment, so we'll see what happens.